The space station was full of refugees from 100 different worlds, and Commander Daniel Vance stood watching them all pass through the long corridors like rivers of lost souls. Earth had been given permission to save 50 aliens from the destruction that had swallowed 17 star systems in just 3 months, and every ambassador was fighting to pick the strongest and most useful ones. But Daniel was not looking at the obvious choices. His eyes found a woman at the edge of the crowd, and she was different from everyone else around her, and she moved like smoke through water with silver skin that glowed soft in the harsh lights, and ears that swept back into elegant points like something from old fairy tales. Most people did not notice her at all, and their eyes would slide past her like she was not even there. But Daniel had spent 11 years in special operations, and he had learned to see what others could not see. He watched how she held herself, and it was not the posture of someone who had lost everything, but the careful stance of a hunter pretending to be prey, and he saw the small creature hidden under her ragged cloak, pressed against her chest. The creature had scales that changed colors in ways that should not be possible, and eyes that held far too much intelligence for any simple animal. Ambassador Liu came to stand beside him with a datapad full of names and numbers, and she started talking about engineers and doctors that Earth should choose, but Daniel raised his hand and pointed at the silver woman. He said he wanted that one, and Liu squinted at the crowd and asked what he was talking about because she could not see anyone special. Daniel told her the processing number and said she was an Elvari female, and Liu laughed and said the Elvari were just myths and old stories that ancient races told to scare their children, and tales of immortal warriors who bonded with dragons. Daniel kept watching the silver woman, and then she looked up and their eyes met across the vast chamber, and for just one moment her disguise flickered, and he saw something ancient and terrible and deeply sad behind those amber eyes that burned like distant suns. He told Liu that if the woman did not exist, then no one would miss her when she was gone. Liu was confused, but she made the arrangements, and within hours the silver woman was brought to the Earth compound, and Daniel finally stood face to face with the creature he had chosen to save. She was taller than him by several inches, and up close her skin looked like moonlight made solid, and the small dragon on her shoulder watched him with eyes that seemed to look straight through into his soul. She gave her name as Elindra, and her voice had an accent that made every word sound like music, and she answered his questions carefully, like someone who had been hiding the truth for a very long time. Daniel asked her why she was trying so hard not to be seen, and she tilted her head and studied him for a long moment before asking how he had noticed her when no one else could. He told her that people who try hardest to disappear are usually running from something terrible or running toward something terrible, and he asked which one she was. She smiled, and it was a sad smile full of thousands of years of memory, and she said she was both. The small dragon chirped, and it sounded like crystals singing, and Elindra sighed and looked out the window at the Earth city spread below them with all its lights and life and noise. She told him that the disaster which destroyed those 17 star systems was not natural, and it was not an accident, and it was the first strike in a war that had been building for 60,000 years. Daniel felt cold spread through his body as she continued speaking, and she told him about the Hollow, which were creatures from the space between dimensions that consumed everything they touched, including matter and energy and time itself. Her ancestors, the Elvari, had imprisoned the Hollow long ago, but someone had been weakening the barriers, and that someone was on Earth, because Earth was special, and Earth was the lock that kept the Hollow contained. Humans carried something in their blood, she said, and it was planted there millions of years ago as a failsafe because only humans could forge the chains needed to bind the Hollow again. Daniel asked why she was telling him all this, and Elindra stepped closer, and her amber eyes blazed with inner fire, and she reached up to touch his face with fingers that burned like cold starlight. She said he had chosen her and he had seen through a disguise that had fooled entire empires for thousands of years, and that made him either the most dangerous human alive or the one she had been waiting 60,000 years to find. The dragon spread its wings, and Daniel realized it had already grown larger since he first saw it, and Elindra told him its name was Pyraxis, and that dragons grew to match the size of the purpose they served. She said the war was coming whether humanity was ready or not, and the only question was whether Daniel would help her fight it or stand aside and watch his world burn. Daniel looked at this ancient woman with her sad eyes and her impossible dragon, and he thought about everything he had ever fought for, and everyone he had ever lost, and he knew there was really only one answer he could give. He told her he was in and asked where they should start. Elindra smiled again, but this time there was hope in it, and she said they needed to find the traitor who was helping the Hollow break free, and they needed to find them before the barriers fell completely. Outside the window, the city lights twinkled peacefully, and the people below had no idea that their entire world hung by a thread, and that the only things standing between them and total destruction were one tired soldier and one ancient elf, and one small dragon who was already starting to grow. 3 weeks passed, and Elindra slowly began to trust Daniel with more of her secrets, and each night they would sit together, while she told him stories of her people and their long war against the darkness. The Elvari had been the guardians of the galaxy for hundreds of thousands of years, she explained, and they bonded with dragons who were not really animals, but living flames given form and thought and purpose. Her people had sacrificed everything to imprison the Hollow the first time, and most of them died in that ancient battle, and the survivors scattered across the stars to watch and wait and guard the barriers. But time wore them down one by one, and Elindra was the last, and she had been alone for so long that she had almost forgotten what hope felt like. Pyraxis grew larger every day, and he was now the size of a big dog with scales that shifted between deep purple and burning red and flames that leaked from between his teeth. When he was angry or excited, Daniel learned that the dragon could feel the Hollow and sense the wrongness of their presence like a bad smell or a sound just below hearing. And Pyraxis had led Elindra across the galaxy, following that wrongness until it brought her to Earth. She told Daniel about the signs they needed to watch for, and the attacks began exactly as she predicted. First came the missing people and the unexplained blackouts and the areas where cameras simply stopped working, and then came the worst things and entire buildings full of people who went to sleep and never woke up again. Their bodies were found in the morning as empty shells with eyes turned to glass and no sign of what had taken everything inside them, and always there was the symbol painted nearby in something that looked like blood but was not quite blood. The symbol was a circle eating itself, and it was the mark of the Hollow. And their servants, Elindra called the servants husks, and explained that they were once human, but had been hollowed out and filled with the Hollow hunger, and they could pass through the barriers that the Hollow themselves could not cross. The husks were gathering power, she said, and every person they consumed made the barriers weaker and brought the full emergence of the Hollow. Closer, Daniel and Elindra investigated the attack sites together with Pyraxis, prowling around them like a hunting cat made of starfire, and each time they arrived too late to save anyone, but they learned more about the pattern. Someone was directing the husks and choosing the targets carefully, and that someone had to be found before it was too late. Then Daniel got a message that changed everything, and it was from his ex-wife, Dr. Evelyn Cross, who was the science advisor to the president, and she said she had found a pattern in the attacks and wanted to meet. Daniel told Elindra about Evelyn and how they had been married once before his work drove them apart, and how she was brilliant but ambitious and always hungry for knowledge and power. Elindra listened carefully, and her ancient eyes grew troubled, and she said they needed to meet Evelyn quickly, because if she had truly found the pattern, then the husks would know it too. They drove through the night to reach Evelyn S. laboratory on the outskirts of the capital, and Paraxis rode in the back seat, having shrunk himself down to the size of a cat to avoid attention. But when they arrived, the laboratory doors were open and strange lights flickered from inside, and Daniel felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. They found Evelyn standing in the center of a circle of symbols that writhed and twisted like living snakes, and her eyes had gone completely black, like windows into empty space, and her smile was no longer human. She greeted Daniel with a voice that echoed with 1,000 other voices layered beneath her own, and she said she had been hoping he would bring the last Elvari to her. Elindra stepped forward and demanded to know how long Evelyn had been serving the Hollow, and Evelyn laughed and said she had found them 3 years ago when she was researching ancient artifacts. The Hollow had promised her knowledge, she said, and power and immortality, and all she had to do was help them break free and consume this worthless little world. Daniel stared at the woman he had once loved and tried to find any trace of her left inside that twisted shell. But there was nothing human remaining in those black eyes. Evelyn raised her hands, and the symbols around her blazed with dark light, and she said the barriers were almost broken, and soon the Hollow would pour through and devour everything. Pyraxis roared and grew larger in an instant, and his flames lit up the laboratory like a small sun, and Elindra drew a sword that seemed to be made of crystallized starlight. The battle was brutal and short, and Evelyn was powerful, but she was still just a vessel, and Elindra was an ancient warrior with 60,000 years of experience and a dragon at her side. But when Evelyn fell, the symbols did not stop glowing, and the damage was already done, and cracks were spreading through the barriers faster than ever. Before Elindra stood over the body of Daniel S. ex-wife and told him she was sorry, but Daniel shook his head and said Evelyn had made her choice long ago. The only thing that mattered now was stopping what she had started and saving the world she had tried to destroy. Pyraxis roared again, and outside the window the sky flickered with strange colors, as the first tears in reality began to appear across the globe, and the war had truly begun. The next 6 months were the darkest in human history, and the Hollow poured through tears in reality, across every continent, bringing horrors that human minds could barely comprehend. There were creatures made of angles that should not exist, and shadows that moved against the light, and sounds that drove people mad just from hearing them, and everywhere the husks spread their hunger and consumed everything they touched. Earth's armies fought back with everything they had, but bullets passed through the Hollow servants like they were made of smoke, and bombs only seemed to make them stronger by feeding them energy. Millions died in the first weeks, and billions more fled their homes, and the governments of the world scrambled to find any weapon that could hurt the enemy. But there was hope, and that hope came from Elindra and Paraxis, who had grown to the size of a small whale with wings that could block out the sun and flames that burned with light from before the first stars were born. They fought on the front lines, and Elindra's sword cut through husks like they were paper, and Pyraxis' fire was the only thing that could actually destroy the tears in reality and seal them shut. But there were too many tears, and too few of them, and Elindra knew they could not win by fighting alone. She called a meeting of all the world's leaders and scientists and generals, and she stood before them with Daniel at her side and explained the truth about the war they were fighting. The Hollow could not be killed, she told them, because they were not truly alive in any way humans understood, and the only way to stop them was to imprison them again, with chains forged from something stronger than any metal or energy. Those chains had to be made from emotions, she said, and specifically from hope and sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal to give up even when everything seemed lost. The Elvari had used their own life force to forge the original chains, and that was why they had nearly gone extinct, and Elindra had spent 60,000 years trying to find another way, and she had found it. In humanity. Humans were special, She explained because they did something impossible, and when they lost someone they loved, they did not just grieve, but they also remembered and honored and transformed their pain into a reason to keep fighting. Her people had understood sacrifice, but they had never learned to live after loss, and that was why they faded away one by one until only she remained. But humans rebuilt after every disaster and loved again after every heartbreak and hoped again after every disappointment. And that made them the only species in the galaxy who could forge chains strong enough to hold the hollow forever. The generals and scientists listened with doubt on their faces, and one of them asked if Alindra was seriously suggesting they defeat cosmic horrors with good feelings. Alindra smiled and said she was suggesting they use the most powerful force in the universe, which was love that persisted even when it was not returned, and hope that survived even in the darkest times. Daniel stepped forward and told them about everything he had seen Alindra do and everything Paraxis had destroyed, and he said if there was even a chance this could work, then they had to try because nothing else was working. It took 3 months to build what they needed, and human engineers worked day and night with Alindra to create machines that could amplify emotional energy and broadcast it around the world. Psychologists studied which mental states hurt the hollow the most, and they found it was not happiness or peace, but hope in the face of despair and determination, despite fear and love that continued even after loss. The weapon they created was not a bomb or a gun, but a song. It was composed from humanity as collective grief and hope, and it would be broadcast from every speaker and screen on Earth and sung by billions of voices in thousands of languages. The song was a declaration that humanity chose to live and remember and fight and keep fighting until the last human drew their last breath. They practiced for weeks and taught the song to everyone who could learn it and set up the broadcast systems to reach every corner of the globe. And finally, the day came when they were ready, and Alindra climbed onto Paraxis' back, and Daniel stood at the command center with his finger on the button that would start the broadcast. The sky was full of tears in reality now, and the hollow were pushing through in greater numbers every hour, and if this did not work, there would be no second chance. Alindra looked down at Daniel, and their eyes met, and she told him that whatever happened, she was grateful he had chosen her when everyone else had looked away. Daniel told her to come back safe, and then he pressed the button. The song began. The song rose from every city and every village and every home on Earth, and billions of voices joined together in a harmony that had never existed before in human history. It was not a pretty song or a simple one, but it was powerful beyond anything the Hollow had ever encountered, and it carried the weight of every human who had ever loved and lost and chosen to love again. Pyraxis flew with Alindra on his back, and his flames carried the song into dimensions that human eyes could not see, and wherever his fire touched, the tears, in reality, began to close and seal themselves shut. The Hollow screamed, and it was a sound that existed in every frequency at once, and shook buildings and shattered glass and made people fall to their knees, but they kept singing. Alindra added her voice to the billions below, and she sang in a language older than the stars themselves, and her voice wove through the human chorus like silver thread through rough cloth. Daniel watched from the command center as reports flooded in from around the world, and tears were closing, and husks were falling, and the Hollow were retreating back through the barriers they had broken, but it was not enough. The largest tear was still growing over the Pacific Ocean, and it was so big now that it blocked out the sun for half the planet, and through it Daniel could see something vast and hungry pressing against reality, trying to break through completely. That was the heart of the Hollow, and if it emerged fully, no amount of singing would stop it, and Earth would be consumed along with everything else in the galaxy. Alindra and Pyraxis flew toward the great tear, and Daniel watched them grow smaller and smaller against that terrible darkness, and he knew they could not do it alone. He grabbed a microphone and broadcast his voice to every speaker on Earth, and he told everyone what he had learned from Elindra about hope and love and the stubborn human refusal to give up. He told them about the ancient Elvari, who had sacrificed themselves to save the galaxy, and about Elindra, who had waited alone for 60,000 years for a chance to finish what her people started. And he told them that right now, she needed their help, and humanity needed to sing louder than they had ever sung before. The response was immediate and overwhelming, and the song swelled to a volume that seemed impossible, and people who had been too afraid to sing joined in. And people who had given up found their voices again. Daniel felt something pulling at him, and it was like a hook in his chest, dragging him toward the great tear, and he understood that he was being called and that somehow he was needed there. He ran from the command center and found a military helicopter and flew toward the Pacific as fast as the machine could carry him, and the pull grew stronger with every mile. When he reached the tear, he saw Elindra and Paraxis hovering before it, and they were blazing with light. But the darkness was pushing back and slowly overwhelming them. Daniel did not know how, but he knew what he had to do, and he jumped from the helicopter and fell toward the tear, and he should have died. But instead he felt Paraxis catch him, and suddenly he was standing on the Dragon S back beside Elindra. She looked at him with shock and wonder and asked how he was there, and Daniel said he did not know, but he knew he was supposed to be. Elindra took his hand, and her fingers burned with cold fire, and she told him that humans carried the key to binding the hollow, and she finally understood what that meant. It was not something in their blood or their genes, but something in their souls, and the ability to hope when hope made no sense, and to love when love brought only pain, and to fight when fighting seemed pointless. And Daniel had more of that quality than any human she had ever met, because he had seen an invisible woman in a crowd of thousands, and chosen her when everyone else looked away. She asked him to trust her, and Daniel said he did, and Elindra began to sing again. But this time she was not just adding her voice to the chorus, but weaving Daniel's spirit into the song itself. He felt his memories flowing through him, and every moment of hope and love and stubborn determination he had ever experienced was pulled from his heart and added to the fire. Paraxis roared, and his flames turned white, and then colors that had no names, and they struck the heart of the hollow with the full force of human hope amplified by ancient magic. The hollow screamed again, but this time it was different, and this time it was afraid, and Daniel smiled and kept singing even as the world dissolved into light around him. The light faded, and Daniel found himself standing in a place that was not a place, and it was the void between dimensions where thought became solid and will became gravity. Elindra stood beside him, still holding his hand, and Paraxis blazed around them both like a wall of living fire, and beyond that wall was the hollow in its true form. It was vast beyond comprehension and hungry beyond description, and it spoke not in words, but in concepts that burned themselves into Daniel's mind. The hollow said they could not be imprisoned again because the Elvari were dead, and the chains were broken, and there was nothing left but surrender and consumption. But Daniel did not feel afraid, and he did not feel hopeless, and instead he felt a strange calm settle over him, like he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He told the hollow they were wrong, and his voice carried weight in this place that surprised even him, and he said the Elvari had not imprisoned them alone. The ancient warriors had built the lock, but they knew they could not forge the key, and that was why they had seeded humanity millions of years ago, because they understood something the hollow never would. The hollow asked what vermin could possibly understand that they did not. Daniel thought about Elindra and how she had waited alone for 60,000 years, and he thought about Evelyn and the woman she had been before. Despair twisted her, and he thought about every person lost in this war, and every person who kept fighting. Despite those losses, He told the Hollow that they understood hunger and consumption and endings and the void, but they would never understand why a dying soldier would throw herself on a grenade to save strangers. They would never understand why a father would work 3 jobs for children who might never know his name, and they would never understand why people rebuilt cities after disasters, knowing they would face disaster again. The Hollow writhed and called it madness and irrational and purposeless. Daniel said no, and said it was love, and love that did not ask for payment, and love that did not end when it was not returned, and love that looked at a universe full of darkness and said it would make light anyway. He turned to Elindra and told her that was what her people had given humanity, and not power or magic, but just the ability to love so stubbornly that even the void could not swallow it. And then he kissed her, and it was a simple human gesture, absurdly small against the backdrop of cosmic horror. But in that moment, it was the most powerful thing in the universe. The chains formed from nothing, and they were not metal or energy, but something more fundamental, and they were the accumulated weight of every act of love and sacrifice humanity had ever committed, crystallized into bonds that not even the Hollow could break. Paraxis roared, and his fire wrote the final lock, and the Hollow screamed as they were dragged back into their prison. The scream would echo through dimensions for millennia, but this time, the chains were stronger because they were forged by a species that would keep feeding them with hope and love and stubborn determination until the stars themselves grew cold. The void dissolved, and Daniel opened his eyes and found himself lying on a beach with waves lapping at his feet, and Elindra was beside him, and Paraxis had shrunk back down to the size of a cat and was curled up on her chest. She smiled at him and asked if he was all right, and Daniel laughed and said he had no idea, but he thought so. 1 year later, they walked together through a memorial garden that covered 300 acres and held tributes from every species in the galaxy to honor the billions who had died. Elindra told Daniel that the Galactic Council had offered her a seat to speak for the Elvari even though she was the last, and Daniel asked what she had told them. She said she told them she was not the last anymore because the Elvari were never really a species, but an idea and a commitment to stand between darkness and those who could not fight it. Earth had 10 billion Elvari now, she said, and they just did not have the ears for it. Daniel pulled her close and asked what the hero of humanity would do, now that humanity did not need saving. Elindra laughed and said she might spend a few decades learning what hope felt like when it was not mixed with fear, and she asked him to teach her. Daniel said he would, and Paraxis chirped happily, and above them the stars shone bright with the promise of tomorrow.